Well, thank you very much for your kind remarks, and I'm honoured to be here. May I endorse everything that has been said so far. Now, in the 1950s, the distinguished Welsh poet Waldo Williams wrote, "Wedir canrifodd midan, clyma fe'i clod, Cymru am a nhw hefyd yn y chwedl. After the mute centuries, I tie myself to mention them. Wales, they too are part of your story." He was in fact referring to the Welsh Catholic martyrs of the late 16th century. Now, as a Quaker, he had no innate sympathy for the hierarchical religion for which the martyrs died. But he did believe that after the mute centuries, these people, these ignored people, deserve at least to be remembered. And this is how it should be. Even those who have no innate sympathy for LGBT people need to recognize they are part of the story too, and the negativity of the mute centuries should be overturned. And they were mute centuries. People have already mentioned the fact that the record just isn't there, because in a way it is too unsafe to make a record and to preserve a record. But they were there. The very fact there was legislation against them proves they were there. You don't legislate against what you see as errors that don't exist. But the legislation was extensive, so the phenomenon must have existed too. The earliest sources, however, suggest that in the mainland European Celts, described by Strabo and others, and the Brythonic peoples, criticized by Gildas, were in fact tolerant of homosexual practices. And one of the stories in the Mabinogion may be a description of such practices. Nevertheless, penitentiaries from the 6th century onwards condemn all such practices and suggest lurid punishments. An Act of 1533 made the death penalty for those convicted. The Act predated the Act of Union between Wales and England by 3 years, and that in itself is significant because both acts were aspects of Henry VIII's advocacy of big government, his eagerness to have full control of his kingdom and to lay down the law about how his subjects behaved. Paradoxically, right-wing Americans who are advocates of small government seem to be anxious that the state should interfere in people's sexual activity. From the Act of 1533 onwards, Welsh court records contain much referring to those convicted, punishments which the Welsh collective consciousness has chosen to forget. As Wales didn't have any large urban centres, a homosexual subculture didn't develop until the 20th century. It seems, however, that certainly by about 1600, gay men from Wales and other people of the same kind of community found refuge in the subculture of London, a subculture which produced such poems as Sydney's "My true love hath my heart and I have his," or the very remarkable poem of Fulk Greville, "Is it the mask and majesty of power to make offences that it may forgive? Nature herself doth her own self deflower, to hate those errors she herself doth give." The mute centuries continued, although in the late 18th century, Wales was the scene of one very remarkable phenomenon, the household of the ladies of Llangollen, who were recognized very discreetly, admittedly, as the most famous lesbian couple in Europe. In fact, the description continued into the late 20th century, for until very recently, the guides who usher visitors to Plas Newydd in Llangollen were forbidden even to utter the L word. That was a sackable offence. So the description of these two great friends, how they made a very nice garden, how most of the famous people of the late 18th century came to see them, and that was all. It's only in the last few years that people have uttered the L word. And I think that is a suggestion of the very deep mute centuries I've been trying to mention. An Act of 1861 caused the death penalty to cease to be the punishment of those convicted. But an Act of 1885 laid down that punishment should involve lengthy periods of imprisonment, and it was, of course, the Act of 1885 that led to the imprisonment of Oscar Wilde. By 1885, the great majority of Welsh MPs were Liberals, but most of them seem to have supported the Act, suggesting that to be liberal is not always necessarily to be libertarian, although, to be fair, it was the Liberals who were in government in 1861 when the death penalty was removed. In the mid-20th century, a Welshman is reputed to have made a significant contribution to bringing the whole issue into public discourse. The Cardiffian, Ivan Novello, whose statue is just round the corner there, composed the opera Gay's the Word, first performed in 1950, and it's widely claimed that it was the opera which popularized gay as a synonym for homosexual, although there are those who believe that its origins lie in an acronym invented in America, G-A-Y, good as you. Incidentally, complaints that a word as cheerful as gay has been hijacked should be answered with a retort that if homosexuals have hijacked gay, many other words, bent, for example, or a host of other derogatory adjectives, can now be returned to the claimants. Then in the late 20th century came Wales's greatest contribution to the ending of the mute centuries. Leslie Whittle has already referred to it, when in 1967 Parliament decriminalised male homosexual activity in Wales and England. By the way, the Isle of Man only did it a few years ago. The decriminalisation was above all the work of a native of the Swansea Valley, not a Cardiff man, though he was a solicitor in Cardiff, and the MP for Pontypool, Leo Absey. It's not too much to say that Leo Absey granted to a large number of people in Wales and England the right of citizenship. I haven't agreed with him on everything he's been saying over the years, but you know, when he's right, I agree with him. When he's wrong, I don't. Other developments happened shortly afterwards. For example, Jan Morris, who calls herself a Welsh Republican. Certainly, she doesn't believe in a principality. The Welsh Republican, Jan Morris, became probably the most famous transgender person in the world, and certainly her very remarkable book is the fullest description of the experiences she had. Others too include the establishment of the Bangor Helpline in the 1980s, the foundation of Kilch in 1990, the Cardiff Mardi Gras in the mid-90s, and of course the foundation of Stonewall. Incidentally, there was mention of, I think it's Liz mentioned it, the riot in Stonewall happened on the day of the funeral of Judy Garland, and Judy Garland claimed Welsh descent. So you could say that the Stonewall Revolt and the existence really has its roots somewhere in North Pembrokeshire. Astonishingly, the establishment of Stonewall Cymru in 2003, when you consider the attitudes over the last millennium, Stonewall receives part of its funding from the Welsh Assembly government. Now, it's almost impossible to imagine that anybody could have believed that would come about, say, 20 years ago. I started with Waldo Williams, I'll finish with him. One of his finest lines is, Beth yw maddau, cael ffordd trwy'r draen at ochr hen elyn. What is forgiveness? Crawling through thorns to be beside an old foe. And the author, John Sam Jones, is also appreciative of Waldo's writing, for Crawling Through Thorns is the title of John Sam Jones's memoir, the finest piece of gay literature to come out of Wales. Waldo also wrote the line, Gobeth vor meistr, rhoid amser I ni'n was. Hope is our master. Time was given to us as a servant. And I'm sure that through the mute centuries, there were those who lived in hope. At last, time has fulfilled some of those hopes, but as everybody stressed, much more needs to be done. And may I say in ending that the term gay community or LGBT community should be avoided. There is only one community, and we are all members of it. But within that one community, there should be a myriad of multiple identities. That is the way ahead.